Thank you, and welcome everybody to the leadership team meeting on Thursday, the 15th of April. The meeting is going to be held in accordance with the Council standing orders and the protocol and procedures for remote meetings, which have been adopted by the Council on the 20th of May. So please bear with us if we run into any technical differences during the meeting. If at any point during the meeting I lose my connection, I'm nominating Councillor Mary Wheel to take over the lead of the meeting until I'm able to reconnect or until the end of the meeting. So during the meeting, recommendations for each of the items will be shown on the screen, and as we move through the agenda, full reports will be available on the Council website. There's a few technical things just to mention. First of all, microphones. All councillors and officers are asked to unmute and switch off their microphones when they're addressing the meeting, and then switch them off when they're finished. Cameras, I'm requesting councillors to switch on their cameras when they're speaking and switch them off once they have finished speaking. And then finally, on questions, if a councillor wishes to speak on any particular item and has not been called to speak, please indicate by using the hands up feature in the participants, and then we can call you in. And the conversation feature, the chat feature on this meeting is not being used for the meeting. So as far as speakers are concerned, members of the leadership team and officers will speak to the report and they're called to speak. And if time permits, a few questions will be taken from the chair and O2 scrutiny committee and any other non-leadership team councillors, but only after lead members have had the opportunity to ask questions and to discuss each items. And so to assess your fellow councillors, officers and members of the public watching online, please state your name before you speak. And I'd like to now go on to introductions. First of all, I'm Kim Taylor-Smith, Deputy Leader of the Council with responsibility for Grenfell Housing and Social Investment, and I'll be chairing the meeting tonight. Shall we go through the list? Josh?
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Josh Rundle and I'm the lead member for Families and Children's Services.
Jem?
Good evening, I'm Jem Kamali, lead member for Adult Social Care and Public Health.
Anne?
Good evening, my name is Anne Siren and I'm the lead member for Communities.
And Catherine?
Hello, I'm Catherine Folkes and I'm the lead member for Equalities.
And finally, Mary.
Good evening, I'm Mary Wheel and I'm lead member for Finance and Customer Access.
Thank you very much, Paul. So first of all, I'd like to invite councillors and viewers now to observe 72 seconds silence. And that's 1 second for every life lost in the Grenfell tragedy. And it's a great poignancy at the moment that we do this again tonight as the inquiry gets back underway on Monday. And this is obviously going to be a particularly difficult time for the bereaved, the survivors and our community. And our thoughts will be with the families throughout. So please join me for 72 seconds of silence. Thank you. Thank you. So I'd also like to take this opportunity for us all to join in a moment's silence to remember His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh. The Duke was a regular visitor to the Royal Borough, and I'm sure that many of our residents have their own memories of him. He devoted his life to public service and will be sorely missed, and our thoughts and deepest sympathies go to our Queen and her family. So please just join me in a short moment of reflection. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So if we might now proceed with the order of the meeting. The first order on A1 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest?
No.
No, good. I'll take silence as acquiescence. Second, A2, apologies for absence. We've received apologies for absence from Councillor Campbell and Councillor Will, and both have sent their apologies. And I just want to check that everybody else is here. I believe after the introductions we are. So again, confirming no other apologies, we can move on to item A3, the minutes of the previous meeting. They're included in the papers, meeting of the 17th of March. And I just want to see if there are any comments on these meetings or whether or not we can take those as agreed. Is there any indication of comments? No, then we would take those meetings as agreed. Thank you very much. So let's move on now to the first paper, which is paper A4, the Voluntary Sector Support Fund. And that is Councillor Anne Sireman. And Anne, would you like to introduce your report?
Thank you, Chair. So this paper is about the proposed Voluntary Sector Support Fund. And this would replace our Corporate Services Grant Scheme, which we independently had reviewed by Rocket Science last year. And then a report was produced with recommendations, which was used to engage around our voluntary and community sector organisations over 3 workshops in developing this proposed fund. Now, as you all know, the corporate grant scheme has been in place for several years, providing core cost funding to numerous organisations across the borough. And the first thing I wanted to say is how important our voluntary and community sector are. We saw in the aftermath of the Grenfell tragedy how important these organisations were in supporting our communities. And since then, I think we've worked really hard to further develop a close and collaborative partnership with the VCS. And during COVID, many of these organisations had to adapt to deal with yet another emergency, with many of our residents who previously didn't require support now needing help. And we've seen all of our voluntary organisations step up and do whatever they can to respond to our residents' needs in really uncertain times. And I would really like to thank each and every one of them for all of their work over the last year. Not only that, but many of these voluntary organisations reach and support communities and residents, which the council does not always hear from. And we lean heavily on these organisations to help us, to make sure that we reach as widely as possible across the borough. We reach people with them, in partnership with them, that we wouldn't normally be able to reach ourselves. So returning to the Rocket Science review, the review involved over 60 of our VCS organisations and also heard from councillors, council officers and other stakeholders who reflected on their residents' local needs. The successor fund proposed in this report has been developed to take into account the findings from this review. So, for instance, the review found that the outgoing programme lacked strategic focus, and so the successor fund that we've put together will be anchored by council plan priorities. The review also told us something that we already felt and had heard, which was that the corporate grant scheme was a closed shop with new organisations not being able to be considered. And so the successor programme, which we're proposing now, opens the opportunity for all eligible organisations to apply and make the case for funding. We're putting forward this fund because we know how important the VCS is, recognising that it has played a crucial role in supporting our residents, especially during COVID, and that it often does work which the council wouldn't be able to do alone. And I think another point to make is it's not just this fund where we're providing support to the VCS. There are a number of other support mechanisms within the council. And as I say, the most important thing to me is really working in close partnership with all of them. So thank you, Chair, and I really welcome any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you. So, colleagues, questions?
I have one, if I may.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Anne. It's a really good report, and good to see that we're supporting a voluntary service sector, and that's something that's really important, especially in the past 12 months with COVID and everything else. I note that you mentioned that work is underway to achieve better coordination, of course, with the provider. How will we go about doing that? What kind of scrutiny would we be able to put on this public money?
Well, I'll probably call on one of the officers to answer that question. I mean, I think from my point of view, the observation that I had is that a lot of the support, and there is a lot of support across the council for these organisations, but we don't always know exactly where it is. So for me, rather than having, say, an organisation with 30 contracts with different parts of the council and it not being lined up, I would like to see one contract, if that's appropriate, or at least not 30 of them, so that we're really clear about who is getting or what support, and that makes it easier for us to compare, impact and outcomes. So I want to see the whole thing become much more streamlined, and for us to be able very quickly to be able to describe what kind of support each organisation that we're partnering with is getting. And I wouldn't say that that's the case currently. But in terms of the actual mechanism, I perhaps call on one of the officers to answer that question.
Councillor Siren, can I suggest it's Sue Harris here, Executive Director for Environment and Communities. Can I suggest that our Head of Service, Michael Kennedy, comes in, who's got a lot of experience in other organisations and will be able to explain our approach.
Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, I think there's two parts to this. One is the sort of specific journey towards better coordination, and I think when you look at the plethora of things we offer to both the voluntary sector and the community, whether it's city living, local life, or rate relief or rent relief, they're all fantastic offers, but they're not easily located in a single place at the front end and really designed around somebody just trying to seek help for their organisation. So I think if we start at that point and work our way backwards into the council and make sure this is designed around making it as easy as possible for people to access services, that's the direction of travel. I think the reason we're talking about a journey towards better coordination is because we're very keen to avoid unintended consequences. It's obviously very sensible that we start to join up. For example, when we are talking about a package of support to an individual organisation, that it might be that organisation is best suited to rate relief or rent relief or a grant. What we don't want to do by rushing into it and trying to do it all in one go is accidentally say, great, we're going to give you rent relief, and accidentally that will count money and essentially take money out of the grant pot. And I don't know if that actually makes sense the way I describe it, but basically it will need a journey, and we'll have to get the technical details right between different grant schemes, especially between different schemes, to make sure that the offer is a cumulative offer rather than one that chips away at the council's offer, is what I'm trying to say. Does that help at all, Josh or Councillor Reynolds?
It does. Yes, thank you, Anne.
And so, Catherine, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, thank you very much, and thank you, Anne. I also welcome this paper, and I particularly welcome what you were just talking about, Michael, which is the better coordination and transparency of money going to all the charities, because, as you say, it's very hard from the outside to actually see how much is going out from the council, and it's and I'm very pleased to be part of a council that does support our voluntary sector. But looking at this paper, there were just one concern I had, is that it talks about outcomes the whole time, but it doesn't talk much about the impact. And that brings me on to the second part of my question, which is who will actually be doing the assessment of the applications? And how, I know you've mentioned that it will have a strategic focus and that will be against the council plan, but obviously we have 5 different parts of the council plan. So who will be making that balance so that all of it doesn't go to 2 bits of the council plan and what the rest of it is? And so I'd like to see what the guiding principles are.
Oh, Catherine, I think we lost you.
I think Catherine's on pause. And I noticed that Mansour Khan has put his hand up. Is that answer?
So I will ask Mansour to answer the specifics of how the applications are going to be assessed. But to answer the first part of Catherine's question, it is going to be this leadership team which makes the final decision on how the money is allocated, and we will be guided by the recommendations of our experienced officers who understand grant making, and of course all of this will be done within our Equalities impact assessment to make sure that everybody is treated fairly. But may I hand over to Mansour to talk about how the applications will be assessed and what the guiding principles will be.
Thank you, Councillor Foulkes, for that question. Just to confirm, so the application process itself is the journey that we'll take towards assessing the bids that come in. But as Councillor Siren said, we'd be presenting the recommendations of who actually gets the award to the leadership team. The application process has numerous things within it, one of which is an expectation for applicants to demonstrate how they meet the priorities. So it's not just a case of selecting a priority, one of the 5, but actually explaining under each priority what exactly will they be delivering and how will it be measured and how will it be demonstrated. And as Councillor Siren said, we'll be pooling together a panel of officers from across the council's different departments to be able to look at the information that's presented, officers who are actually already familiar with the voluntary sector and work with lots of these organisations already. And essentially they will draw together the information that's presented. We will triangulate the information, so we will talk amongst ourselves and look at the information. In many cases, these organisations are already sort of delivering services that we know about. So we'll be in a pretty good situation to be able to sort of assess the information that they offer to us. And essentially, we will then put that forward as recommendations to the leadership team.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jem, we have a question.
Thank you. It's a bit of a technical one, maybe for officers, but I just wonder if, given the Citizens Advice Bureau changed premises and they sort of operated digitally most recently, I was just wondering what the grant that's attributed to them, is that going to include the ability to re-procure premises as well, or a lease or something like that?
Thank you, Jem. I certainly will hand over to Mansour Khan if I could for that specific question. Mansour.
Thank you, Councillor Kamali. So the CAB currently get the grant, just like the other 28 organisations, and they're being extended until the end of September. But of course, in the report, we're proposing that we move towards a contract with the CAB, within which they will have to demonstrate what funding requirements they have and what it is for. So they'll have to demonstrate, if it's for premises costs, they'll have to explain that to us. We know they have operated digitally. That's partly also because of their arrangement with their existing landlord came to an end. But I do know that the CAB are looking for a premises in North Kensington. I'm fairly certain that they'll want to remain situated in North Kensington once the pandemic eases. And I think they will want to demonstrate what rental cost their contract has within it. So they'll be bidding, essentially, they'll be demonstrating to us the cost of their contract, within which there'll be a rental element, yeah. Does that answer your question, Councillor Kamali?
Yes, thank you. I look forward to seeing it. Thanks.
So thank you. I think have we covered everybody from the leadership team? If we have, then I'll now call on Councillor Marie-Therese Rossi, Chair of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and Councillor Mason, Leader of the Opposition, and ask if they have any questions. And Pat, I can see your hand is up.
I don't know if Councillor Rossi wants to go first.
You can go first, Pat. I'll go after you.
I would like to defer to you, but okay, I will. When I was a scrutiny chair and we began the discussions about how to rearrange the grant scheme in the climate of many of the new Grenfell voluntary groups or volunteer schemes saying that they could not get into the system. So the question really is, given that the pot is going to remain the same, and by the way, I also believe the voluntary sector and have for a long time do a stunningly great job, but we were discussing about how the scheme could be altered so that those little groups can get in, and part of the problems that they have is, and it was the same on procurement, because I had a procurement scrutiny as well, is that they found the system so administratively onerous to get in. Small groups, maybe as the Grenfell groups were and are, able to do brilliant service in their communities on the ground, but they don't have the resources or maybe sometimes the expertise to actually enter the grant scheme. Whilst they can do a brilliant job, they can't enter the grant scheme. Now, see in 5.6, the council is allocating 100k and expect to make between 15k and 20k to around 10 of these smaller organisations. I assume it's the ones I'm talking about. So the question is really, how will the system be amended so that they can enter? And of course, they may need help to enter. And if they don't produce A1 applications, whilst they may be able to produce A1 services in their areas, they will not be able to get into the grant system. So really, how have our officers and how will the leadership team ensure that it is that fair system that I think you mentioned, Kim? How will it be fair, given that the big organisations, whilst I'm not criticising them, they do a brilliant job, they are able to manoeuvre through the system. How will we make it fair for those organisations we want to enter to be able to enter in the new scheme?
Okay, thank you.
So,
Anne?
Thank you, Pat. And I think, we really have had those smaller organisations and the newer organisations and the Grenfell organisations in mind when we designed the proposal that we're bringing tonight. And I am going to ask Mansour to talk a little bit about that. But the other comment I suppose I would make is there are other mechanisms for funding that are available, some of which may be more appropriate to the smaller organisations. And I know that the officer team will work really hand in hand with all these organisations to try and work with them to get the support that they need. But perhaps I can ask Mansour Khan, if I may, to just talk a little bit about what we've done with this new proposal to make sure that, particularly the small and newer organisations are given an opportunity to bid.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Councillor Mason. It's a really valid question. So we've done. There'll be at least 3 things that I can speak about. One is that some of the small organisations, as you said, Councillor Mason, they're often difficult, so they find it difficult to articulate an application, but actually they can deliver a service. For smaller organisations that have an income and expenditure or a turnover of less than 150,000, they'll be protected for applying for small grants. So if a large organisation wanted to apply for one of the small grants, we'll want to make sure at least 10 organisations get in before the bigger organisations have a chance. So their turnover will determine that they're small. We're also going to be putting on one-to-one support sort of via Zoom. So those will be advertised pretty quickly to all our organisations, but especially the smaller ones are going to be able to access that. We'll also be able to, in these sad realities, there will be lots of organisations that may not get to funding, but we will be setting up a triage process for anyone who doesn't get a funding to work with them, to be able to signpost them to other opportunities. We do know that the Social Council, for example, works in that space, but we also do as officers, we know about other funding opportunities. So those are the sort of 3 things I'd say sort of a major on, but there'll be other things we can do to help small organisations.
Okay, thank you, Mansour. And Mary-Therese, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I'd like to say that I also welcome the paper. I think that the transition has got to be seamless, because I know that some organisations have been worried about their funding going forward, and they need certainty to be able to sort of plan their programmes. That's all I really have to say.
Okay, thank you. I'm just looking down the list to see if there's any further questions from councillors. If there's not, I just really want to echo what's already been said. That I'm proud as far as the council, the support we give our voluntary sector to keep it thriving and vibrant, because they do provide such a fantastic and valuable service throughout the sector, and I do wonder to myself as to where we would be if we hadn't got the voluntary sector coming out of lockdown. But thank you. So if we can now move on to the recommendations, which are set out in paragraph 2.1 within your papers. They are hopefully coming up on screen. Paragraph 2.1. If not, they're on page 3 of your papers. And so I'm going to ask if they, I'm happy to read out those recommendations as we don't have them on the screen.
They're on the, they are on the screen, Chairman.
They are on the screen. Okay. Okay. So yes, they are. Right. So are we all happy to approve this? Are all agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Excellent. Then I will declare that as approved, and we can move on to item number 5. Which is the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Strategy. And it's fair to say that obviously as a leadership team, we're all very proud of the diversity within our borough, and it's one of our greatest assets, and it makes this place the best place to live. So I'll call again on Councillor Anne Siren, to introduce the paper. Anne.
Thank you, Chair. Well, this strategy sets out how we are going to address the inequalities which we see across the borough. So it highlights our commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion in the way that we engage with residents, how we take decisions and deliver services, and how we treat our workforce, as well as how we intend to deliver on those commitments. This is the corporate framework for the council, and other strategies, policies and delivery plans, such as the approach to equality impact assessments, are led and shaped by this. It's therefore a really important paper, and the reason it's before the leadership team today is that I'd like each of you to commit and approve what has been set out here. So I think, as Kim has said, diversity in our communities is what makes this borough an amazing place to live, and we all want to celebrate that and protect it, as well as making sure that all of our residents are treated fairly and offered the same opportunities and support. The reality is that many of our minority ethnic groups have been disproportionately affected by COVID in terms of health outcomes, employment and financial stability. And the Black Lives Matter movement has shone a light on the structural inequality that exists in public services. We know this is very much true here in Kensington and Chelsea Council, and that makes this work even more vital. We can't change everything, but we need to be clear about what we can change and work really hard to ensure that we do it. And I'm absolutely passionate and committed to deliver real action which leads to change and supports all our residents in addressing the inequalities. As we hopefully now move to recovery post-COVID, we have to support everyone who lives here, and that includes the hard to reach, the vulnerable, and the many who are now for the first time suffering financial hardship and exclusion. And you'll see that our strategy sets out our 5 objectives and how we will monitor the impact we have in the borough. The strategy is not just words on a page, and I'm determined that it will not be words on a page, but it will result in action which will lead to significant change. Implementation and progress against all aspects of equality, diversity and inclusion will be monitored and reported annually against our priorities set out in the council plan. There are already various work streams underway, which will work in tandem with the strategy to deliver our commitments. So we are inviting the LGA to undertake an equalities peer review this summer. This is an independent review, which will identify where we need to make changes and improve our performance for people with protected characteristics. We've also established a cross-party advisory group, which I chair, and its role includes overseeing the work of our council departments in improving our equalities work. And I just wanted to say, I really value the challenges and insight that this group provides. We also have a corporate equalities board, which is chaired by our chief executive, Barry Quirk. And this is the main internal governance forum for both workforce and service delivery activity relating to EDI. And there's a delivery tracker, so we will be able to see what progress is being made. Also, I wanted to mention that the Communities Department have just completed the recruitment of a citizens panel. And this consists of a representative sample of residents across the borough who will take part in consultation activity and co-design exercises. And if you permit, Chair, I'd like to ask Barry to provide a little bit more detail about the work that's already going on across the council, please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I could say in the last, over the last 9 months or so, the council really has stepped up because of challenges that we've had both internally and across the authority about the actions that need to be taken. Because there's a tendency, I think, in equalities work, and it's a work I've been personally involved in for very many years, there's a tendency to describe the problem, to draw dry maps or identify measures of the problem. What's necessary is that we interpret the overlapping dimensions of inequality and that we develop ideas for tackling inequality in our locality. Now, most of the ideas will be London-based ideas, but there will be some that will be actually targeted for the specific needs that we have locally, because we all know the scale of inequality that exists in Kensington and Chelsea. By that I mean the material economic inequality, which drives and is the cause of many other inequalities, added to which is the wickedisms of racism and sexism and so on. So from those ideas, we then organise actions to deliver tractable changes locally. And it's really important, I think, the point that's just been made about actions to deliver. But we don't just do that as an organisation on our own. We must do it in partnership with other public organisations locally that themselves are subject, like we are, to the public sector equality duty. So the Corporate Equalities Board that I chair, that involves senior directors and people from across the organisation, as well as the Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion Network of staff, representatives of staff, whose role really is to challenge us while we are considering what we're doing. Our focus has been on what we as an authority, but what we do in our partnerships with others. So we've had discussions, for example, on crime and what is it we're doing in relation to work that we need to do to support police and the criminal justice system achieve much better outcomes in respect of equalities, particularly in relation to race equality and racial justice. Also, we've had some input on schools and educational attainment, and we're working further with schools and other aspects of the school strategy to make sure that takes on board these issues of inequality. But look, inequalities in Kensington and Chelsea, as members will know, is reflected and refracted through the tenure base of Kensington and Chelsea. Not only do we have very many ultra high net worth individuals living in super prime property, actually 35% of people who live in our borough live in social housing, which is why when we look at the impact of COVID, which has had both in terms of health, but also in terms of the economy, what we notice is it's exacerbated inequalities. So of the total number of universal credit claimants in our borough, and universal credit in London has gone from 400,000 last February to just over 1 million this March. Now, in Kensington and Chelsea, we have a relatively low number of universal credit claimants in 11,400, but that is still virtually double what it was a year ago, and it's highly concentrated. So nearly 30%, I think it's close to 28%, just over 28% of people who are claiming universal credit live in just 3 wards in the borough, in Goulburn, in Colville, in Notting Dale. And there are 3 wards in the borough that just have 6% of the total universal credit claimants. And so what we find is this spatial concentration that really reflects social housing. Chelsea Riverside, for example, is 5th. So we need to look at not just the mapping, the description of things, but what are the underlying causes, and what about those causes can we intervene in and make a tangible difference? Because the important thing is, in my view, that we focus our efforts in this area of inequality, we focus our efforts on those with the most urgent and pressing needs, and ensure that all of the authorities' resource and strategy is directed to those, rather than just spread thinly across all of our service functions and all of our geographies.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barry. So I think before I open this up to colleagues, I've got a quick question of my own. The strategy quickly mentions the annual report on equality outcomes that's part of our council plan. So I suppose my question is that, will we be separating these out as 2 separate reports? And is there a risk that the EDI outcomes will get diluted when mixed with outcomes across the council plan?
Well, if I could say that if you remember, the council plan has 3 themes, one of which is narrowing the gap, and we intend reporting on achievement and progress, and also where we've not achieved progress in each of our priority areas as well as in the themes. And so okay. The answer
will be a separate report. Thank you. Thank you. Right, I have a lot of hands up, so let's start with the top on my screen. Mary, would you like to ask your question?
It was more of a comment, really. It just that within, obviously, a lot of the activity here falls within either HR or procurement, and that one of the things I've been really encouraged by is something that that Barry alluded to, and that's internal organisations, staff-generated organisations, and networks within things who are there to challenge and give ideas, and I think that's a really healthy sign in our progress towards greater equality and diversity.
Thank you, Mary. Johnny, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Kim, and thank you, Anne. I think it's a very good paper. Equality, diversity and inclusion are incredibly important, and as you said, diversity is one of the greatest strengths in this borough and what makes it such a great place to live, work and learn. I think the question I want to ask, though, is how we're going to turn this strategy into action. We all, I think, support the aims that you've set out, but what kind of action can we expect from it?
Well, thank you, Johnny. And I think that's, it's a really important question, and something that I'm really, really focused on. I mean, obviously, this strategy sets out what we're going to do, why and how, but it's not an action plan. But we do have to set out our strategy before we have an action plan. But that doesn't mean that we're not already starting to work towards achieving actions. So, for example, I think within the workforce work stream, we've made some progress, and within procurement. I think we've got various monitoring mechanisms. So the implementation and progress against all aspects of equality, diversity and inclusion will be monitored and reported annually. We also have the Corporate Equalities Board chaired by Barry, which is the main internal governance forum, which is going to be looking and watching and scrutinising the delivery tracker so we can see where progress is being made. On the cross-party board, advisory group, which I chair, we're going to be making recommendations to the leadership team for actions. And also the LGA Equalities peer review is going to also include reflections on progress to date and recommendation for further action. So, I feel like I've really challenged officers on this, and I want to see action. And I think all of us on this leadership team want to see that. So I think we've put some mechanisms in place to get those actions. But, I guess I'll be looking to everybody on this team to make sure that happens over the coming months. But thank you, Johnny. I think it's a really important point, because I think we're all really aware of the issues, and we want to do something about it.
Yes, if I could add to that, I think that this is not a case of a small team of people drafting a document and then these people delivering things. This is about the whole organisation working with our public sector partners to try to tackle substantive and material inequality, and also to tackle the dimensions of that, where it occurs and where it's evident. And that means that we need equality, diversity, inclusion to be threaded through all of our service functional strategies. So that's why I mentioned, for example, the work that we've been doing, looking at other agencies as well as ourselves, as well as our suppliers. And so, for example, we're very aware, aren't we, that of the prominence in public concern about the issue of mental health, and the very acts of us working collaboratively with our NHS partners in the COVID period over the last year or so, has meant that they've shared with us information really about the differential outcomes by the 29 GP practices that we have in Kensington and Chelsea in relation to mental health. And I think that means that in working with the NHS, in working with other housing providers, in working with the police and the criminal justice system, I think that we need to make sure that all of our functional strategies that are about, whether they're about planning, housing development, or the matters I've just spoken about, they all should have equality and inclusion and diversity as part of their purpose. Because if it wasn't for equality, diversity, inclusion, it really shouldn't be a public sector action, to be frank. It should be, it's fairness and justice that underpins what our purposes are.
Very true. Thank you, Barry. Josh, I have your hand up.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, and a good paper again. Really support this, as everyone has said. I won't go over what they have said earlier. Just a question, maybe for Barry. Barry, as you know, we the leadership team at the last meeting approved the inclusion strategy for schools, especially trying to reduce exclusions in the borough. I'm just saying how this particular strategy would work in conjunction with that, because I just don't want necessarily double up or things kind of falling through the cracks, because there's a lot of plans flying around. We just want to ensure that everything runs smoothly in a coherent manner.
Well, I think the only way it might give additional questions to colleagues in the school sector, and by that I mean the head teachers who are delivering the inclusion strategy, as well as Ian Heggs and his colleagues who are supporting them in doing that, is the fact that they would need to really consider probably a broader range of protected characteristics than schools conventionally do where it tends to be about ethnicity, ability, and so on. It may be that there's an issue in relation to other protected characteristics, particularly issues of gender reassignment, for example. Now, I know that the schools inclusion strategy will be principally focused and is principally focused, for example, on ensuring that there's not any disproportionality in relation to ethnicity and race of children excluded from school. But an inclusion strategy which is for schools should need to look at really the full public sector equality duty. And that is incumbent on all of us in the public sector to do that. That's possibly the only issue that the inclusion strategy needs to examine is whether it covers all those aspects. But I'm sure that colleagues that are working on this centrally will work with Ian to support if there is any need for any refinement or nuance in the strategy that was just been agreed.
Thank you, Barry. No, that's really helpful, and that's a lot of food for thought. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Josh. Catherine.
Thank you very much. Just apologies if this has been answered, but I've got very unstable connection, so also if I disappear again. But I also welcome this paper. It's a really important paper to bring. I just wanted to ask Barry about the workforce, and apologies if you have answered this, which is firstly sort of what has already happened with the council workforce, and just to what progress you've made. But also particularly when you say we will recruit. So how have your recruitment processes actually changed, and how can you assess? I mean, I always think that must be the hardest thing, to have a really fair recruitment process that is also diverse. Oh.
No, we heard you.
That's okay.
Yep.
I heard all of that. What we've done is, first of all, to examine where there are issues. And by that I mean where there are disparities, or whether that is a gender or an ethnic pay gap, for example, where the problems of that occur, whether they're organisational or whether they're professional or occupational, whatever. And we've reviewed our total pay and grading approach, so that this year, and it's as of the end of March, that we actually changed all of our pay and grading arrangements for those 1,000 or so staff who receive performance-related pay. We've negotiated that out so that that is no longer a supplemental amount that people on higher incomes earn. And that's really been driven by an issue of fairness across our organisation, because in essence, we were giving bonuses to staff for their focused activity as managers and as professionals and in their performance, but we weren't doing that for our frontline staff. And what we've done is we've had a thorough independent examination of our pay and grading, and that has created a much more fairer pay structure. We've also looked at how we hire people and made sure that we don't have recruitment panels that are only people of one gender, or only white men on recruitment panels, for example. So we're making sure that all recruitment panels, and we've trained, there's I think 30 volunteer staff from our race equality network, have offered, and we've trained them so that they can be involved in recruitment, so that we sort of score against, we undercut any biases, any unconscious biases that there is within in the recruitment process. And those all staff involved in recruitment have undergone training in respect of minimising any, if not eradicating, bias in recruitment. So I think we've done work there. We've also supported this equality, diversity and inclusion network. We've done so really for the past 9 months or so. We've also got a race equality network. We've got an LGBTQI+ network as well, and the disability group is forming. It's currently inchoate and hasn't constructed itself as a staff network. But I think encouraging these self-organising networks of staff who themselves have experienced either discrimination or injustice or bluntly racism or sexism in their careers, it's important that we enable them to give voice to their concerns and also to challenge the organisation in what we're proposing in coming forward. So I think that more inclusive recruitment approach based on evidence and based on the idea of progression is really what we've been doing. And if you were to ask me, is there evidence that? I would say that there is evidence that this is producing a different profile. But it's early days, it's only 9 months or so. But I do think that whether this is senior or head of service staff and so on, that actually we've got an increasingly diverse workforce. What we have to be mindful of course, is that our workforce, more than 80% of them won't live in Kensington and Chelsea. They commute into Kensington and Chelsea, or they normally do. Most of them working, some of them working from home, or some of them working from home and coming into the office. But because of that, when we're looking at what is the profile of the workforce, the profile of our workforce is more like London. We've got to remind ourselves that we're looking really at a London workforce, not just a Kensington and Chelsea workforce. With that in mind, we've also had lots of work done on local recruitment, on improving the rate at which we're hiring people locally. And we're using the apprenticeship approach and other approaches as well to ensure that that happens. That's been particularly successful in certain areas, in HR, in housing and so on. But I do think we are making progress, and I think we'll be able to report on that progress after the year.
Thank you, Barry. Mary, I still have a hand showing for you. Is that a new hand or a new question?
Sorry, it's an aberration. I'll take it down.
Okay, then again, if there's no other questions from the leadership team, Marie-Therese, do you have a question?
Just a comment, really. I mean, I think that this is a very important paper, and obviously tackling inequalities is crucial to the health of our borough, and it does have to cut through all of the work that we do in terms of providing services, but also, as Barry has just alluded to the recruitment and to the promotion of the workforce, and also to ourselves as councillors. I think we have to be aware that diversity is in no way a barrier for any kind of progression through the council. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Therese. And Pat, you have your hand up?
Yes, Chairman. Well, to me, I must be reading a different paper, because the paper reads to me from woolly to aspirational. And of course, it's not an action plan, as Councillor Siren has said. And I agree with many of the things that have been said about what it might be doing, but there's no connection on this paper. And I have to tell you that the number one complaint I've had for the last few days about this paper is that the very residents, and especially in the very wards that it's meant to be directed at, do not have any right to speak at this leadership team or any leadership team meeting now, where they may and will want to give their views on this. They say, why is it that they are approving and discussing a paper about us and about our aspirations, about narrowing the existing inequalities for us. The Grenfell tragedy, it says, and its aftermath raised fundamental questions about inequalities and diversity, and they raised those, and about eliminating unlawful discrimination, etc., and all the things that Barry said. But we the residents, and we the people in the North Kensington wards that are the worst hit with universal credit and inequalities, they are not allowed to have an input into this meeting in particular, or any meeting, to say to give their views. We are deciding for them. In other words, the message out there is we know better than you do. The other thing.
So, Pat, your question is why are they not allowed to speak and give input to to the
well,
to
yes,
the paper?
that's question number one. Number two is this is not a strategy. This is an aspirational woolly paper. I'm not disagreeing with it as an aspiration, but there's nothing actually attached to it that I can go out there and say to residents, well, they're doing this, that, and that on these different areas that will better your life. It's very woolly, disconnected stuff spread throughout, perhaps, as Barry said.
Not specific. Your second question is what are the specific things rather than the generality?
Yeah, but the number one thing is you need to be hearing from the very people who you are talking about.
Well, I think that's a good question.
They want to have an input, but they can't. They're stuck on YouTube listening to this debate, but they have no say here now in a paper you're going to approve for them, about them. And the message out there is you as a leadership team know better than they do.
Okay.
And we don't.
So I can put that as a question, Pat. Do you have any other further questions? I mean, it's a question on the paper and a paper and
I mean, the paper talks about the inequalities in housing, in income, in health, in education, in skills, and in racism, etc. But there is no action plan, of course, to say how that will happen.
Can I request to ask that question to
Can I just
Barry?
Say one sentence? The remedy to some of those would mean challenging government policy in those areas where we would perhaps agree across the chamber that some of the government policies enforced in these areas are encouraging or causing the very problems this paper is supposedly meant to be trying to fix.
Okay, thank you, Pat. So just to summarise then, Dr. Quirk, that we've got a question of have we spoken to residents because and got their input onto this paper? The second is that do we have specific things rather than aspirations? And then finally, what can we do to challenge the government again to help us fight this battle?
Kim, they want to be able to speak at this meeting. That's the point. They want to be able to speak at this meeting as they used to in the past, but can't now. It's not what you said to them 3 weeks ago or in a little group. They want to be able to speak at the leadership team meeting to give you their views on this sort of paper and on this paper specifically. And they can't. They're stuck out there on YouTube listening, probably frothing and being annoyed, and they have no right to come in and give their views. Why shouldn't they give their views about a paper that is meant to be about them and their chances and their lives and the inequality that they are subject to?
Barry, would you, or are you happy to answer that? Thank you.
All I can do is say that I apologise to those who are excluded from participation in generally the council's approach to some overarching strategies, and that's what this is. It's not an action plan. As I said, the actions are actions of the functional services of the council and of our work that we do with partners. And when we've got those established, there will be an action plan. We'll be able to thread it together. Rather, like I said, this was one of the 3 themes, and we have priorities as a council, and we have service functions, and we'll be able to say, this is what we need to do in housing. This is what we need to do in environment. This is what we need to do in our social care area. This is what we need to do on mental health. We will have a list of those, and there'll be actions for them. And what we will need is to bring those together and say, what are the most pressing issues that we need to deal with to tackle the worst inequalities that are faced and the worst experiences are faced by those who are the most excluded. And in that regard, we will have, without question, a community conference, citizens panel, discussions with people, discussions with local citizens and active citizens about these matters. But this is, if I could say, an overarching sort of strategic paper that says this is what the council's intention is, so that all of its functional areas and all of its partners are aware of that, and then we take it forward with a developed action plan in each of these areas. We can't, if we were to do the action plan, we would be prefiguring all of that work, and we can't do that.
Okay, thank you. So the action plan is to follow. Thank you very much. Pat, you still have your hand up. Is that a supplemental question?
Well, I didn't, but I think that that we should include the public. If this will not go to a council meeting, obviously. As far as they're concerned, they're excluded, and we should not be excluding them. And the other thing to say is that we've had 4 years to develop a strategy to deal with the inequalities that Grenfell threw up, and how long more is it going to take? Another 2 to 3 years? I mean, that's the other thing. Of course, it's always the ball kicked into the future. So that's the other thing they're saying.
Well, I think the comment is noted. I think Barry has answered that question and given indications of things that have changed. But this is a journey, and again, I apologize if people feel that they've been excluded from this. And it's important that obviously that they can be included as we go along the road, so to speak. So I'm just looking to see if there's any other questions from any other councillors. If there are no other questions, then may we move to the recommendations on 2.1 of the report, which hopefully we're going to see up on the screen in a minute. Where are we? Recommendations. Yes, no, we've got the recommendations. So for the leadership team to approve, are we all in agreement?
Agreed.
Or anybody not in agreement? If there isn't, then I will declare that as agreed, and then so we can move on to the next paper, which is Modern Slavery, paper A7. And again, I'm going to call on Stuart Priestley in order to present. Stuart.
Good evening, Chairman. Good evening, everyone. My name's Stuart Priestley. I'm the Chief Community Safety Officer for the Council. And I'd like to talk to you about the Ending Modern Slavery strategy. So this is the Council's first modern slavery strategy, although we have quite some experience of delivering innovation in this area. We set up a human trafficking project a number of years ago across Europe and in London. So we've quite a bit of experience of operating in this area. You'll see from the strategy that the kind of bedrock of our approach is the coordinated community response. This recognises that the responding to human trafficking and modern slavery is everybody's responsibility, that we've all got responsibilities in knowing the signs, identifying potential victims, and taking steps to bring their situation to the light of authorities and organisations which can respond. The Council has got some statutory responsibilities in regards to its role as a first responder for the national referral mechanism, but it's also got some responsibilities in regards to its safeguarding responsibilities. And also the Council has taken a lead, as I say, in providing a partnership locus for bringing partners together, working with statutory partners, with the voluntary sector, with the faith sector, with residents as well, and also reaching out to and engaging survivors. Very much the strategy is focused around collaboration, and it was very much co-designed with input from all of the people that I've just described, as well as survivors. You'll see that kind of central to the approach is a theory of change model, which was developed again through a very much collaborative co-design process, and structures the strategy across 4 domains: victims identified, victims supported, exploitation prevented, and exploiters brought to justice. I hope you'll agree. One of the things that I'm very pleased about with this strategy, and I think comes across, is you can very much hear the kind of voice of the survivor within this strategy. The final thing I would say is that it is a 5-year strategy, and it is backed up by an action plan, which will be reviewed and revised each year. There is a multi-agency modern slavery group, which I chair, which meets 4 times a year, and that will act as the quality assurance to the delivery of the strategy, and will report into the Strategic Community Safety Board. So there's a golden thread of governance that exists around assuring the delivery of the strategy, and the strategy, as I say, is backed up by an action plan. And I think that's all I'm going to say, and I will happily take any questions or comments, but I'll hand back to you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And I very much think us wishing modern slavery didn't happen in this borough, but it certainly does, and it's a good report, and thank you for that. And it's good that we're taking responsibility to tackle this important issue. So I'll open this up to questions. Do we have any questions from the leadership team? There's a question come in from Jem.
Thank you, Stuart. And yes, I fully agree. It's something we absolutely should be tackling. I suppose my question, and it's sort of alluded to in the report, but do we have an expectation of how pervasive a problem this might be, and also sort of any particular concerns? I see the difference between Westminster and KNC on ethnicity. They have far more Chinese, presumably from around Chinatown area, whereas our ethnicity seem to be different. What's sort of making the changes in our borough?
I think we are probably in a better position of understanding the extent of and nature of these issues within our borough. But I think it would be truth to say that we are really unsighted on the. It feels a bit like the tip of the iceberg, because of the hidden nature, because of the threats and the coercion, because of the insidious way that the traffickers and exploiters conduct their business. It has been in the past really difficult to understand the nature and extent of trafficking in the borough. We've undertaken some work with an organisation called Stop the Traffic, and together we've developed a model which pulls all of the data from across a range of organisations locally, and it's that we've used to build our local model of the understanding of the nature and extent. But within that model, we recognise there are gaps within the data that we've got. So we're continually trying to refine that. Stop the Traffic have adopted this model and are working with the Mayor's office, MOPAC, to try and replicate and roll this model out across London. So whilst we do have a good understanding of the extent and the issues with the data that we've got, we recognise that there are data gaps. What we've seen in recent years is an increase in men coming to the attention as victims of modern slavery. Men who have been coerced or tricked to come over, foreign nationals to come over, and then find themselves either begging or committing crime, or working within construction industries, or working within catering or what have you, for very little money, if any at all, just enough to keep them alive and keep them going. So we have noticed, so our understanding is grown. There are some gaps, and we have noticed some changes within that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm looking for other hands from the leadership team. Are there any questions from further questions from the leadership team? If not, then Mary-Therese, would you like to answer?
Yeah, if I could ask Stuart, is there any way you could sort of tie in with licensing? Because I sit on the licensing committee, and sometimes, I mean, I'm not talking about proof of anything, but sometimes with the massage parlours and the nail bars and that, I have a degree of suspicion about what might be going on, and I don't know what to do with it because, you know, you're not sure. But, you know, the licensing, those sorts of activities have to be licensed. So could you tie in somehow with licensing?
Yes, so certainly our licensing colleagues, both in the police and locally, are part of the MSC partnership. I think you've highlighted a really useful area, actually, because we know that that people are trafficked into those industries, and we also know that those who are working in those industries are particularly vulnerable to MSE. So that's part of our work, is to work with licensing and licensing colleagues. But I think there is more to do within this area for us. So yes, that's something I'll take on board and continue my conversations with colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Pat, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, Chair, Stuart, through you, Chair. You said quite rightly that what we need is what we should have is a coordinated community response, and that it's everyone's responsibility, which it is. And to follow on from Maria Teresa's question, given that we have in excess of 40 different nationalities in the borough, it's probably very difficult for people to look around and identify that. And how do you do that? Secondly, given that only 4 businesses respond to the consultation, as it says in 6, one of the things that may be missing from the strategy, but you may well have thought about it, is in terms of the reasons for it, is companies selling goods that are potentially made with slave labour, or people buying it. How are we going to influence people not to do that? And I think that's probably it, really. How do how in the last year, for example, how many ordinary residents have phoned up, or there may not be any figures, but the problem with saying there should be a coordinated community response and that residents should identify possibly people who are in slave labour or traffickers is, how do they identify them when you've got like 40 different nationalities, 300 different nationalities across London? It must be impossible to actually do that. Never mind that if you're caught doing it by those traffickers, your life may be in danger, or you may be in a violent situation. How do we ask residents to do that? How could they possibly identify those people unless it falls right in front of their face?
Some really good questions within there. If I start with the residents question, I think what's key to part of our approach is trying to raise awareness with as many groups as possible, be that our staff, the staff of other partners, or with residents. And there are a number of both online training programs, and we have delivered training programs, or awareness, I would call it awareness raising programs, to different groups of residents and residents associations in the past. And these are quite simple, really. It's about knowing the signs. So what are the signs of modern slavery? And what we know is that people who are, and this is borne out in the strategy, what we know is people who are victims of modern slavery are walking amongst us every day. You know, they are hiding in plain sight. So what are the things to look out for? And then also, very importantly, what do you do about that? So what you do about that in the easiest sense is you phone up the Modern Slavery Helpline. There are a number of learning modules, online learning modules that we promote through our engagement with residents. But I think you're right. There is a challenge with that in trying to reach a point where we've engaged with enough residents that there is a kind of a sense that it's a difficult environment for traffickers to operate and exploiters to operate. And I think that's what we want to get to. I think we're quite away from that at this point in time. If I might say that, but that's part of this strategy, is engaging with residents and businesses. If I might say, I mean, the strategy itself is a partnership strategy. There are a number of partners who are stakeholders in delivering the strategy, and they are working in communities from across the borough, and that includes delivering services to residents who don't speak English as a first language, who speak many other languages, and that's part of our collegiate collaborative approach, is to work with the voluntary and community sectors as part of our partners, our stakeholders, to deliver the strategy. I hope that goes some way to answering your questions, Pat.
If I might have just one short supplementary, Chair. It says in 6.4 that, of course, in the consultation, the recurring themes raised in the consultations were about the vulnerability of asylum seekers and people with no recourse to public funds. Survivors told us that not having the legal right to work in the UK whilst waiting for decisions on their asylum or trafficking case can cause further exploitation as survivors feel forced to work illegally to have enough money to live. Exploiters take advantage of this by not paying the minimum wage and threatening to tell the immigration authorities, etc. I mean, I know you know all about this, Stuart, but that's a real honeypot for the traffickers to dip into, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that makes people very vulnerable, and that vulnerability is what the exploiters prey on. Part of our strategy is trying to make sure that immigration advice and support is available through the voluntary and community sectors for those who find themselves in those situations with no recourse to public funds.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So if there are no further questions from any other councillors as well, so shall we move on to approve the recommendations that are set out in paragraph 2.1 of the report, which are shown on the screen. So the recommendations of the report are to, as listed. So are we all in agreement?
Agreed.
Agreed.
If we're all in agreement, then again, thank you. We can approve that, and we can move on to paper A7. And this is a paper for you, Johnny, on authority to permit the parking of e-scooters.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think this could be quite an exciting
is
innovation
now
in
exiting.
the borough. Oh, somebody's leaving, so they obviously don't think so. But the council is due to join the Pan-London rental scooter trial that's being launched at the end of May. We've already written to London councils to indicate our participation. And as part of that scheme, one of the things we have to do is designate e-scooter parking bays to enable residents to start and end trips so that we don't see some of the things that we see with ad hoc parking, like we have with dockless bike schemes that have sometimes frustrated certain parts of our constituencies. Although some carriageway parking bays are going to be used as designated e-scooter parking, this paper allows officers in consultation with members, and I should say with residents too in practice, designate areas on suitable sections of footway for parking of e-scooters. They would be designated using white lines and the e-scooter wording only, similar to how specialist car parking bays are marked, and they could be in conjunction with discrete signs too. The minimum width of an e-scooter bay will be 1.2 metres or 0.8 metres if arranged in echelon fashion. And the minimum length of a bay will be 3 metres, which should allow for at least 6 e-scooters in any particular bay. The maximum length, I should say, is at the discretion of the borough, and that's something we'll need to look into. Officers are only going to designate these bays on areas of footway where we believe collectively that there is a sufficient width and where existing street furniture means there's little impact on pedestrian flow. We're hoping to launch with around 20 bays at the start of the trial, but we all need to keep everything under review. This is something new for us, just as it is for the rest of London, and we need to understand what the impacts are and whether we're getting the balance right. I think that trialing some and seeing how it goes is probably the right way to begin, but every location will need to be evaluated and seen if it's the right one. And likewise with any new locations that we seek to introduce, I think talking to our residents will be one of the most important things so that we can best understand how to facilitate what is hopefully going to be something that becomes a big part of transport in London.
Okay, thank you, Johnny. So do we have questions from the leadership team? Josh, I can see your hand has shot up.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Johnny, for doing this. I think this is really good for us to, be ahead of the curve on these things, and the public e-scooter trial is welcome on my part. I just have a question. I don't know if it's perhaps for you or for officers on the call. In section 8.1 of the report, it talks about that 3 suppliers will be appointed for the trial, and then it goes on to say that £5,000 will be collected from them to cover the costs. But that seems extremely low to me. £5,000 is like chicken feed effectively, when we could be getting perhaps a lot more for our money. We could put it back to other schemes, transport schemes in the council. I don't know who is on the call who is able to answer that specific point, but that would just be really welcomed by me.
Thanks, Josh. Just on the sentiment, I completely agree with you. This is a fantastic thing for the borough, and it shows us being progressive and promoting sustainable transport in the borough. But on the substance of the latter part of your question, I may just hand over to officers.
Thank you. I know Mark Chetwin is on the call and is probably best placed to.
Hi, Mark.
Well,
good evening, everyone. Yes, Mark Chetwin, but I think actually Caroline, who's been leading on this, was just about to answer the question, so I would let her do that and then come back to me if we need to. If that's okay.
Caroline?
Hi, yes, sorry. Yes, so can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, great. So the amount of funding that we're due to receive was actually set by Transport for London, so it's across all of the boroughs. It's not something that we could influence as part of the trial. But we do also get a portion of all the trips ending in the borough. So basically we get a small percentage of all the trips that end in the borough, and we're expecting that to be quite a few because we think RBKC is going to be quite popular. So we're not completely sure how much that's going to be yet, because literally nobody knows how many trips are going to be made. It's all a trial. And as I say, the trial runs for a year. So in the future, I suppose that there would be opportunities for negotiation. So this is just for the length of the trial.
So Caroline, on that, where would the some of that money then go? Like the parts of the trip into RBKC and parts of this £5,000 to cover costs?
So actually, I don't think we know quite yet if it can be like the extent of what other things it can be spent on if there was money left after what we need to implement the trial. So you'll see in the financial implications, we're not expecting it to actually cost very much to put in these bays because they're literally just marked, and some very quite cheap signage. So yes, I don't think we're actually sure if there was money left over. Obviously there will be some maintenance, repainting, but we're not sure at the moment.
And is that £5,000, is that indicative of other London boroughs, or is that something that we've just thought was a reasonable ballpark figure?
No, this, as I say, it was set by TfL, who have basically led on the trial, and that was what was basically quoted, I think, in the tender process that they did.
I see. Great. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thank you. And Jem.
Thank you. I'll start by saying I welcome this. I think this is a really, this is something that's obviously happening around Europe. It's now coming to London. I think it gives our residents an opportunity to distance from public transport and make their way around the borough. I suppose I would sort of caveat by saying it's not incredibly active travel in that you're just standing still on the machine, but I suppose you would do the same on the tube or on the bus. And my question really is, I can imagine residents will be somewhat concerned, and I'm thinking with my hat on for adult social care, it would be around the hazards that they might present on the pavement. So whilst I appreciate we'll have the bays where they're meant to park, I'm sort of careful that our residents have a way of making sure that if there are trip hazards or risks of injury, that the operators are liable and they put that right. So I was just wondering what mechanism do we have to make sure that these operators are actually operating safely?
Thanks, Jem. And I think, quite right to comment that whilst e-scooters are a good thing, there are a few greater evangelists in Kensington and Chelsea for active travel than you, and it is quite right that we should continue to promote that too. I think just on the pavement point, the tricky balance that we've had to weigh up here, and I've talked to some residents about it already, is that if we are to participate in this trial, either have to authorise parking on the footway or in existing parking bays. And I know that for some residents, parking bays are sacrosanct. So this is a mechanism that allows us to show some discretion and to allow parking on the footway where we think it doesn't have a damaging impact on pedestrian flow. But I think just on the liability point, it's probably best that I hand over to officers.
Hi, Jem. So liability is sort of the same as if somebody walked into a sign that was on the footway in terms of liability for the council. But if we're talking about the scooters more generally in terms of people doing bad behaviour, that is something only the police can enforce, unfortunately, because they are classified as motor vehicles. So if we're talking about people misusing the scooters, going on the footway, actually travelling on the footway as opposed to parking, that's something sadly only the police can enforce. And in terms of liability, it's really sort of personal responsibility in the same way cycle hire schemes or car sharing schemes work.
Thanks, Caroline. I suppose I would just follow up by saying, obviously the police have, I would argue, far better things to do with their time than moving e-scooters around the pavement. So I was just wondering if there's a way that if, a photo is taken by a resident of one that's been dumped or it's not being parked correctly or something, are we going to sort of build that body of evidence to maybe have docked scooters or some other alternative down the line, perhaps? But I do support having a trial. That's what they're for. Thanks.
Thank you. Actually, if I may, before I ask, I've actually raised a question in my mind as well, although I have to say that when we're talking about safety, I know we're talking about being on the pavement. I also think in terms of the riders themselves, in terms of their safety, because there's no requirement for them to put helmets on. That's not part of the hire. You just pick the thing up and off you go. I think one of the things I might be wrong on, I understand that they've got geo tracking on these scooters as well, so that might be something in terms of if there was access in terms of data about the ones that are being roguely parked, etc. But I think my question is that in terms of the location of these bays, I mean, how are you determining the location? Is it something where they'll be next to a bank of Boris bikes, so you effectively have a whole area of people who've got different modes of transports, those that want to be more active or less active? So I just wondered if you could just expand a little bit about how you're going to determine where you're going to put them.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. It's probably the question that will be on most residents' lips tonight. They'll want to know where the scooters are actually going to be. I think it will be a mix. We're looking at locations at the moment, and I'm sure officers can add a bit of colour on that. We will be setting out the exact locations over the coming weeks. I think one other point that I failed to capture, though, in my introduction was just to say that it's great that so many of colleagues are welcoming this, but this is also something that I spoke to the Labour spokesman for transport about before we set out our intention to pilot it, and likewise to the Liberal Democrats. So it's something that I think our borough will begin with strong cross-party support. I don't know if officers can say much more about specific bays at the moment.
I can try and add a little bit of colour to that. So the way we started in terms of finding the bays was actually asking similar operators of similar schemes where they suspect the key destinations are going to be. So, and it's as you might expect, it's stations like South Kensington Station, Kensington High Street. So, for example, on Kensington High Street, we're actually looking at adding an e-scooter bay, as you say, to the side of the cycle hire station outside the town hall. So that very large piazza outside the town hall. We're actually proposing to try and put an e-scooter bay next to the cycle hire docking station there. So yeah, when we talk about the footway, we are picking areas that are very large in most cases. So we're not expecting that any of the ones that we're looking into currently will prevent pedestrians, particularly those with wheelchairs or prams. We don't foresee people being prevented from using the footway in any way.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So looking down the list, are there any other questions from lead members? If not, I'll ask Marie-Therese. Do you have any questions or comments?
I comment. I mean, I don't have a problem with having scooters parked on the pavement, but I am worried about scooters being sort of ridden along the pavement because, you know, cyclists are doing this all the time, and it doesn't matter what you say to them, they don't seem to care. And, you know, especially a little scooter, I mean, to me, that, you know, if you've got an old person and a scooter, you know, there could be an accident, and that actually does worry me that they will, if you encourage them, that they will actually use the pavements, particularly when they're wide pavements.
Yeah, no, I think that's a concern that lots of our residents will have. It's one that's been expressed to me. I certainly am clear, and I think the council is too, that we will not expect people, you know, we do not want people riding on the pavement, and that we will encourage the authorities to take, you know, appropriate action where we see that. I think one of the advantages that I hope will come to pass from participating in the pilot is that we can start to shape the enforcement around that. And play a more active role in how to improve sort of use of e-scooters in the city, and just make sure that people are using them responsibly.
Okay, thanks, Johnny.
Thank you. And Pat, you have your hand up?
Yeah, well, I also welcome the e-scooter trials if the vehicles are, of course, operated safely, because it's another alternative to these damaging fossil fuel vehicles. But of course, already the e-scooters are being driven all over the pavements wherever you go. And it's, of course, it's already been said that enforcement is going to be a problem. Someone said the police have got better things to do. In the report, it says that, of course, TfL has advised that traffic police are engaged with the trial planning and that they're preparing to enforce against misuse of both private hire and e-scooters. And I'm skeptical that anything like that will happen. The message to the trial message, or the message that have been coming out in the last few months from the Department of Transport and TfL about the trial, has sort of translated onto the street amongst e-scooter riders as it's been legalized. And I say, well, no, it hasn't been legalized, but there'll have to be a very strict message. Otherwise, the people who are hiring will think, well, why should I bother hiring? I can just pop into some place, buy one, and off I go. I mean, every day when I go out, and I walk around obviously North Kensington a lot, but I do walk around the area of the town hall, hardly 5 minutes will go by and you will see an e-scooter rider whizzing towards you or past you on the pavement. Very rarely on the roads, sometimes on the roads, because of course it's too dangerous for them to ride these on the roads quite often. I assume that's why they ride on the pavement. So the message is going to have to be quite clear. There's already a perception that it's legal, and also that it's unenforceable. They just believe, I assume, that it's unenforceable because I don't know where the police are arresting them and taking them off them. But I've never seen a stop, and I've never seen an officer stop one. So I assume that they think, well, it's probably never going to happen to me. I'm off. So the messages are going to have to be quite clear, and we're going to have to bring the residents with us, because we're not going to be able to promise that e-scooter riding on the pavement will stop. It's not going to stop. It's going to continue unless you have an officer on every corner. It's just not going to happen. But we must bring the residents with us. It's good that we've got a vehicle that is not emitting fossil fuels, that is gassing us all. But we're going to have to bring the residents with us.
Thank you, Pat. I think the point is noted, and I think we note also the slight contradiction between an e-scooter that can go on the road and a private scooter that can't, and that's something which I hope the government would make moves to clarify at some point, because it is obviously at the moment very confusing and very inconsistent. I think the only other comment I would make is that you also see incredibly bad behaviour on people on bicycles as well as e-scooters. So it really is people being far more aware of not only their own safety, but also others. But anyway.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is that I think the fact that you can see so many e-scooters when you're out and about, Pat, shows the necessity for us to participate in the trial. We need to go with the grain of the public's behaviour and make sure that we're regulating it and allowing it in the safest possible way. And I think just in terms of making sure that the messaging is really clear, this is something we both welcome, we both support it. There's a role for all of us as civic leaders across the council chamber, as it were, to provide clear, succinct messaging to our residents that they can all understand and promote.
Anyway, I noticed that, Mark, you put your hand up. Do you want to just come in on some of the comments that have been made?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, just to say really on those concerns, which I think we all share to some extent about people using the scooters on the pavement. It does remind me of discussions going back 10 years or more about cycle hire stations, some of which are on pavements and some of which are in carriageway bays. And there was a concern that we would somehow be encouraging behaviour that already existed, i.e. people cycling on the pavement. There was a view that we would be sort of enabling that or encouraging it in some way. But I don't think now people would say that cycle hire, has been something we should get rid of. It's generally been seen as a success, I think. So although there may be more e-scooters as a result of the scheme, I don't think it necessarily means that we're going to be seeing more people riding on the pavement rather than in the road. And of course, the other thing to say is this is a report about the decision as to whether to allow parking of the e-scooters on the footway. Johnny has already taken the decision about participating in the trial. So it's perhaps just worth having that in mind as well.
Well, thank you very much. So if there are no further questions or any questions from other councillors, shall we move to the recommendation again set out on paragraph 2.1 within your sheet? And if we're all happy, are we all agreed that we agree with the recommendations?
Agreed.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. So we're now moving to the final paper, A8, which is the Digital Partners Framework. And Councillor Mary Wheel, this is your paper. Would you like to speak to it, please?
Yes, I mean, essentially, this is a very simple paper. It's about increasing our capacity in a cost-effective way to buy in expertise for projects. We've got quite a lot of projects on at the moment, and sometimes they're circumscribed by a lack of internal expertise that it's simply not efficient to have all the time. And this framework, which has no minimum, so we're not sort of signing up to any cost at all, except when we actually need it and there's a business case for it, will allow us to get some much better value resource quickly. And there'll be mini competitions where there are more than two members of the framework with expertise, but otherwise we might just be calling off preset prices. So it's as simple as that.
Good. Well, that's certainly brief. Are there any questions on this from any members of the leadership team, or Marie-Therese or Pat or any other councillors? I think we'll take them all together.
None from me. Thank you, Kim.
Pat?
No, Chairman, I have no questions on this.
Good. Oh, well, excellent. Well, then that's a swift one. You've got off lightly there, Mary. So if there are no further questions, then I would suggest that we go to the recommendation to approve on this. Yes, there is on 2.1. So the recommendation again is to approve. Are we all in agreement?
We are indeed.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you very much indeed. So this obviously now concludes the matters on the agenda, and I just really wanted to check with members if there are any other urgent business that they would like to raise to this meeting. Then if there's not, then I would thank you all very much for attending. Thank you, officers, again for attending. I'm noting that some of you are still in the town hall. And this concludes the meeting, and our next meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, the 12th of May. Thank you and good night.
Good evening.
Thanks all.
Good night.